Okay, we're going to wait a few more minutes to get started for the Planning Commission, City of Portland, June 27th, 23. We are just waiting for quorum, so we'll give it just a few more minutes here.
And I don't know if you can hear me, but I am attending. Maybe you need more people beyond me. See you soon.
Hi, Eli. We can hear you. We still do not have quorum, even with your much appreciated attendance there. We're still waiting for, I think, two more commissioners before we'll have. Oh, just one. Just one more, and then we'll have quorum.
What's the news? What's the news? You got domestic part. You got hitched. Half hitched. Congratulations.
That's awesome.
I would expect nothing.
I was gonna say
less.
I approve of that.
Okay, then I'm gonna see something.
Oh, there he is. Okay. Michael is joining online apparently. So there he is.
Okay, I'm going to call to order. We now have quorum of commissioners. Again, this is the June 27th, 2023 City of Portland Planning Commission meeting. And for commissioners present, we have myself as chair, Mary Reno Mera, Commissioner Patel, Commissioner Routh, Vice Chair Pouncil joining virtually, and Commissioner Spivak joining virtually. We are going to do a shift, just a slight modification in the order of the agenda, move the housekeeping orders down after the bylaws discussion so that we can continue to the consent agenda as the top of business here. So with that, do I have a motion for approval of the minutes from the June 13th, 2023 Planning Commission meeting?
I move to approve. Ms. Routh.
Second it. Oh.
Okay. The motion has been moved and seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
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 And the motion carries. Okay. We will proceed now to discussion and put up for vote our commission bylaws. So I welcome Sandra Wood from BPS.
Good afternoon, commissioners. Thank you for having me here today. Sandra Wood, BPS. I'm one of your support staff for the Planning and Sustainability. No, the Planning Commission. Getting my head in the room here. As you know, we've been having discussions about the bylaws, and what we really want to do today is adopt them. We have had several discussions about a few amendments to the bylaws, and I think rather than run through those discussions. I think we've all been present at those discussions. I hope you feel that we heard you and that we incorporated the changes. There are basically, I think, 5 changes that we incorporated that have to do with what the purpose of the rules were. And I'll go ahead and share my screen so you can see what I'm talking about. 1 second here. So I'll just briefly go through these really quick. The purpose of the rules being that the Planning Commission performs its business and responsibilities in an inclusive, effective, efficient, and equitable manner. There was a change to this section, and I'm going to disclose that I just changed it a little further. So the section is about the officers, and there's responsibilities for the chair, responsibilities for the vice chair, and then what you discussed was having possibly a presiding officer that's not a chair or a vice chair. So what we sent you earlier last week did not have this heading of a presiding officer. So I just added that heading of presiding officer can be somebody that's not a vice chair or a chair. That was this section. This section here is about representation on other boards. Sorry.
Pardon, Sandra. We're realizing that we don't see the document that you're sharing. Oh, there it is. Okay, perfect.
Oh,
Sorry, I just wanted to make sure the commissioners were able to see. Perfect. Do you want to maybe go back really quick to show that one
Yes.
change? Yeah.
I saw some really great eye contact, and I was like, wow, well, this is really. I was like, they're really auditory learners here. Great. So this section is in the officers. I just added that number 3 underline with presiding officer. So we're kind of like calling out who can be the presiding officer, and that the presiding officer can be the chair, the vice chair, or somebody else who's delegated, and what the process is there that it's going to be discussed at the officers meeting. Yes, and we will renumber below that elections, and we'll renumber the length of officers' terms. But I think that's more in keeping with the conversation we had and what the role of that person would be. Representations on other boards, committees, and groups, and this is when other groups are requesting for a planning commissioner to participate in their groups and what that process would look like. And that is that discussion would be brought here to the dais, and that discussion would take place here. The meeting schedule, really no change to the meeting schedule, as you all agreed. Let's see, what else do we have here? I think that was it. That was it. The 2 things that you did discuss more at length that didn't make it into the bylaws was the youth commissioner. And we're going to put that in the 3rd document that we have, which is our operating practices. And the other one was whether we wanted to continue exploring on whether the commission could be open for public comment on projects that you're not a decision maker on or recommending body on. But we have those as placeholders for the next document that we work on when we get back together in September or so. So that is what I hope that reflects what you recall as being part of the conversations. So I think at this point, we're looking for a motion and a second and a vote.
Thank you so much, Sandra, and for all the work in updating the draft bylaws for the commission. I will open it up for a motion to approve the bylaws as amended.
I second that.
Okay, all in favor? Or is it
Aye.
roll call?
It's a
Sorry. Roll call, please, Julie.
For sure. O'Meara,
Aye.
Patel,
Aye.
Council,
Aye.
Routh,
Thank you so much for this work. Aye.
Spivak.
Thank you. Aye.
The motion carries.
Great.
Bylaws approved. Thank you again.
Thank you.
And so next we'll go to any items of interest from commissioners. And Commissioner Spivak, I know you're in transit there. I did intend to ask if you had an update from DRAC. So if the timing's not right or no update, feel free to pass and we will ask the
I
rest of the
think,
commissioners.
yeah, I think I'd love to do an update, but the timing's hard, so I'll hold out for the next one.
Yes. Okay. We'll wait for the next meeting opportunity for an update. Thank you. Any other items of interest from commissioners? Okay. Seeing none, I will invite Patricia for the director's report.
Thank you so much, Chair O'Mara and Commissioners. Patricia Diefendorfer, Chief Planner with the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. I do have a few quick items for you, just mostly reminders. So one thing I want to congratulate you on your first legislative action that you've taken. The parking compliance amendment project was approved by council on June 7th and will be effective this Friday. So congratulations on making laws and legislation. We also wanted to update you that we have conducted our first annual report of the residential infill project. It's based on limited data, but we do have some information to share about in this first year what kind of development we've seen as a result of RIP. And so I'm sure that that's something that you all are very interested in. And so we plan to give you an update, kind of a briefing on that annual report, probably in the first meeting of September. So stay tuned for that. We want to remind you, of course, that we do not have a meeting July 11th. That meeting will be canceled. And our next meeting will be our next regularly scheduled meeting on July 25th, where we will continue with staff trainings. We also, I think at the urging of Chair O'Mara, we wanted to have a social event for a summertime social. So I think that Julie sent a doodle poll looking for dates for people when you might be available to join that. So please, if you could respond to the doodle poll, that would be great. Also, I think some time ago, Julie had sent an email that our communication staff are interested in writing a little bit more of a kind of blog post story about your backgrounds and your biography. And so if you haven't responded to that email, please send some things Julie's way so we can put that together into some kind of article that we'd like to share publicly. So that, I think we're trying to get that by the end of the month. And then finally, we wanted to share kind of a fun event that one of our staff who's working on some resiliency work is partnering with TriMet to do a cool bus shelter design competition. And that competition culminates at the D-Pave block party, which will take place on July 28th at Southeast 7th and Sandy Boulevard. And so one of the things that we wanted to do was to see if one of the planning commissioners wanted to be a part of the jury for evaluating the design competition entries. So if that's something anybody would be interested in, we would like to get any volunteers who might want to do that. And we are trying to secure that by July 5th so that we can coordinate accordingly. So if you have any questions about any of that, please let me know. If you are interested in talking about what commissioner might be interested and available to join that event, that would be great.
I think it's tradition to nominate someone who is not present.
So we will probably circulate email of interest if that works, Patricia, and confirm by July 5th. And it's just one member of the commission.
Yes, that would be great, Chair O'Mara. Just one member, and we'd love to know by July 5th if there's anybody who's interested.
And since we are missing some commissioners, I wonder if a follow-up email could be sent out with just the time, date, location, and that might generate a little bit
Yeah,
broader
when I
response.
send out draft minutes tomorrow, I'll put in
Perfect.
the extensive details and let
Okay.
you all know.
Thank you so much. That sounds like a really fun event, and I appreciate all those updates, Patricia. With that, I think we're going to transition to our training for the evening and welcome Harmony Dashiel. And please let me know if I've mispronounced your name. Feel free to introduce yourself, but welcome. And you are going to be giving a training focused on equity. So
Yes.
thank you. Welcome.
Thank you. Is my little mic on? Okay, perfect. Thank you for having me. Thank you for the introduction. My name is Harmony Dashiel. You did great in pronouncing it. I use she, her pronouns. I am the interim equity manager at the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. I've been with the Bureau for about 5 years, was on the equity and engagement team, and came from Parks and Rec. So I've been with the city for a good long while here, but happy to be here today to talk equity and what our commitments to equity are, and also how it shows up in planning and sustainability, specifically with the planning work, because we are the Planning Commission. And then we'll have some time for questions at the end. So looking at what our to-do list is for this evening, we'll talk about where these things show up in some of our bigger documents, public commitments, where it's kind of our guiding star of how we organize the work, how we show up to community, and where we are accountable to what we do in the projects that we run. And then be able to really pull apart what the resources are to staff, so that by the time something comes to you all at the Planning Commission, it's like, oh yeah, they've been able to go through all of these things, or these are the different trainings that our staff has gone through. So you have a good, clear picture of what it looks like before it comes to all of you. So the first place that I wanted to highlight is in our 2035 comprehensive plan. This really kind of highlights everything that our goals are between now and 2035, and it's front and center. This is like in the introduction. I took this quote right out of the comp plan. It says the equity framework and the 3 integrated strategies, health, connected city, and economic prosperity and affordability in particular, provide the foundation for the comprehensive plan's goals, policies, capital project lists, and map. And so just setting the stage there of what we are doing between now and 2035 is front and center, focused on equity. So before we decide which projects we're going to do, how those projects are executed, that equity is the number one. And then the rest of the comp plan is built up to support what that looks like. So I think that really helps just ground all of our staff in, hey, this is the expectation. This is the ground rule. It's not the add-on. It's not the if we have time or if we have capacity. It's foundational. Here's the groundwork, which I really appreciate that our leaders have taken the step to do and put into place. Again, in that strategic plan that we have, this echoes it. So the strategic plan is supporting our comp plan, and this again is from the introduction and straight at the beginning of the plan to set the tone that as we work towards our long-term goals set forth in Portland's guiding plans, including the Portland plan, the comp plan, all of our climate action strategies, equity is the overarching lens that we use, from planning initiatives that address the disparities and impacts created from a racist history in land use and zoning, to our work with community partners to advance a zero carbon city that provides benefits and opportunities, particularly to those most vulnerable to climate change. What I appreciate about this and want to point out is that it highlights not just that we're focusing equity, but that piece on vulnerable communities. And so a lot of times what we're looking at is who's being impacted the most. As we make decisions, as we push the work forward, being mindful of what those impacts are. We did some studying and some looking at a policy called donut economics, which if you're unfamiliar, if you kind of envision the work as a donut and the community as a donut, you have the outer, which is maybe you're more affluent and who has the excess, and then your inner is who don't have enough, that there's a need there. And wanting to make sure that if we are pulling things from the excess, that we're not harming that inner circle. So really looking at the cause and effect and being able to play with that and be mindful of that, of what actions we do, and thinking 3 steps down the road to what are the impacts that it will have, because everybody makes unintentional oopsies and we want to do our best to mitigate that. So really kind of taking a broader look at, if we do this, then what about that? And we'll get a little bit more into that tonight, where how we train the staff to be able to look at those potential, just different outcomes. City core values, so taking it kind of outside of BPS, the last two places that we saw that equity showed up was planning and sustainability specific, but really looking at what goes to council after a program or project leaves here is that it's going big citywide. And so our first two city core values, they're always listed first, are the anti-racism and the equity city core values. I want to highlight here too that for staff, part of our evaluation process each year is it's called success factors. It's kind of in the weeds, but part of that is to set these goals that then were measured against, like, did we achieve these? Did we do these things? How does our work show up? And that this anti-racism and equity was a city standard that we put in that as part of our staff evaluation process. So every single person, not just in BPS, but that goes through those success factors, had to be able to show that throughout the last year that they were contributing to an anti-racism project program, incorporating that into their work and in their equity. And then they could choose another one, but really important to measure that the top 2 out of 6 are really focused on equity in some component, and that's a place as staff where we're being held accountable and being evaluated each year. All right, so how do we implement this? What does that mean for staff? Like, it's in all these places, but those are our words. So what's it look like when we actually put it into action and into process? The comp plan in chapter 2, that whole piece of it is about community engagement and community involvement. And what you'll see as we go through this evening is that while our focus is equity, there's going to be a lot of chat about engagement and outreach, and those two things go hand in hand. The way that we get to equitable outcomes and center equity in our work is going to be with how we communicate, how we show up, how we involve community to make sure that those decisions that we make are equitable. And that can show up in a lot of different places in these plans and projects. We'll dig into that a little bit more this evening too, but they really do go hand in hand. Our team is the equity and engagement team because BPS realized that you can't have equitable outcomes without equitable engagement. And so how do those play together, and how do we coach our staff? How do we coach our teams to be able to make sure that we have the information so that we're making knowledgeable decisions to center equity? But that whole chapter 2 of the comp plan is focused on outreach. What does community outreach look like? What are our commitments to community outreach? And setting some baseline standards. We have the community involvement committee. We'll dig into all of these a little bit deeper here in a second. Our equity and engagement team, and then we'll spend some time just getting an overview of the equity toolkit that we utilize as a bureau and has been adopted actually by some other jurisdictions and other bureaus as well for the work that we put into that. Okay, we're gonna set some base ground foundational stuff here real quick. This is a slide that you all have seen before, but just a refresher of the legislative process. And so a lot of what we are talking about comes on the earlier side of things because of that outreach and engagement component of it. So looking at where the discussion drafts that even maybe sometimes prior to that piece of when do we decide what we're doing and when are those decisions made, there's a spectrum of engagement of, is it really early in the process and community is informing what the needs are so that we can make sure that we're prioritizing the work in an equitable way? Who do we need to talk to? The stakeholder analysis, making sure that we're really centering that. But definitely by the time it gets to discussion draft, if that's where the project needs us, is to be there and say, okay, where do we need to get out there? Who do we need to communicate with? Who is this impacting? That's a very common question that we're going to keep circling back to. And so how do we reach those communities or those people that are being impacted? And then it may come up again in the proposed draft, like, okay, we made some tweaks to the discussion draft. Where could it come up again? And maybe again down the road, but definitely we want to have it on the front end. Not usually, if at all possible, does happen sometimes, but not usually at the end where it's just like, it's all baked. So here you go, check a box because we're telling you about it. It does happen sometimes. Sometimes we don't have a whole lot of agency over when and what a project looks like or how much we can change. And I think that's an important thing to note, that while we would like to say we can do all the engagement every single time, the reality is we can sometimes. We absolutely consider equity and engagement from the beginning and from conception. But a lot of our work comes from council or the state or the federal government, and we don't have a lot of agency, but we need to execute it. And that outreach and engagement may come at the end where it's more of an informed process. So we'll chat about that too, and I have a nice visual later on of what that looks like. But we do our best we can given what the lay of the land is of can we involve people and put an equity lens from the beginning? Can we do it in the middle and we have a couple things that we just need to do but want to bring it in and get input? Or can we at least be really mindful of when we're doing the outreach, what it looks like even in an inform? Who are we informing? What communities do we need to really lean into to make sure that they know what's going on and the impacts? And do we need to make a note if we know that there's disparities that will be caused by our work to do another thing like, okay, this is going to happen, so we need to make sure that this is our next thing that's queued up to address that. These are also a couple slides that you may be familiar with from a previous presentation that has been here, but just kind of looking at the lay of the land and where our focus is on. We sometimes take for granted when we throw around terms like vulnerable communities or at-risk communities of what that means, but breaking down some of the data to what we're dealing with and who we want to focus on. These are just some of the incomes of what that looks like and some of the racial and ethnic group disparities that while here in Portland, our incomes have raised, they have not raised as fast for our communities of color. And so that's always a focus for us of if we do something knowing that, sure, everyone's income is raising, but cost of living is raising, but it's not rising equally. So being mindful of what those decisions make. If we go and really put a lot of work and effort into a community or a neighborhood, more parks, more sidewalks, all of that, it raises property values, but we want to be really mindful of displacement. And we've been able to see it in other cities and communities too, where it is that best of intentions, like, hey, here's this part of town that needs attention, has historically not had that attention, but if we do that, how do we maintain that those same communities that we are focusing on do not then have to move out because cost of living goes too high? So taking into consideration what that means, what's realistic. We are a wealthier city, but there's a lot of people here who do not have that wealth. That there's a pretty big gap there. Oop, wrong way. This map is helpful just in thinking about where that looks like then. So we know the numbers because not all of Portland is vulnerable community, and there's always going to be pockets here and there of multifamily that might be, but really being able to focus on where the concentrations are. So it's going to be like your darker blue lines. You'll see kind of that quarter that goes along the Columbia. A lot of that is butting up to some of our industrial land, and then that outer East Portland. So I think what your experience here on the Planning Commission will be is that a lot of our projects increasingly are focused on like outer East Portland because there's a huge chunk there of that vulnerable community and community that has not had a lot of attention in the past or a lot of voice in the past. And so we're very mindful of that. Does not mean that we're ignoring the rest of the city, but it does mean that we're acknowledging some of those past harms that we've done and that we know and say, okay, here's where we need to spend some time, effort, energy. Our communities of color are there. That's Park Grove School District has more than 50% of its student demographic. That's communities of color. And so really being able to lean into that and say, what do these communities need? Because that's going to generate equitable outcomes. If we're doing things that are only focused on inner city, we have this gap that's out there. And so we've got work to do, but that's what you'll hear throughout your tenure here on Planning Commission is that a lot of that focus is going to be in these areas that are darker colored. All right, so I mentioned Comp Plan Chapter 2 that this is all about outreach and engagement. So part of it is how do we know what community needs? Like what does equity look like in the work that we do? And we can make some best guesses, but I will tell you from personal experience that even when I'm like, I know this area, I know this community, when I do the outreach, my assumptions are always checked. There's always something that I didn't think about or I didn't know or a demographic that I wasn't familiar with because I might be familiar with some, but not all. And so this really walks through and sets some goals and sets the tone of what our focus should be and what that looks like. So approaching community involvement as a partnership, and that for me resonates of it's not just us going and talking to people and checking some boxes, that there's a give and take in what we do, and that's what equitable engagement will look like, is not so transactional, but just, hey, we are community together. I work for the city, I live in the city, you are using the city, you live in the city. We are on some level on the same team, but we have to approach this together of what can we do, because we also have some boundaries that we have to play within, but also we want to hear what you need and being able to come together collectively on what that looks like. Social justice and equity, where are those disparities? What does that look like? How have things in the past lined up with where we're at? We are, I believe, for the first time looking at a generation that has been displaced twice, of people, a group of people who have been displaced from North Portland to outer East Portland, and now are getting displaced from outer East Portland out of the city. And so being really mindful of what does that social justice look like in that experience, real life experience here in the city. Valuing community wisdom and participation. We're not going to know better than the people that it affects. And while we make best intentions of like, hey, maybe this is the need or this will help this community, the people who know that best are going to be that community. So whenever possible, to be able to say, even if it's a gut check, here's what we're thinking. How does that land? Am I missing something? Or in a better place of just like, you tell us, what do you need? What would make this area more functional? What would make you more economically prosperity? Like, what do you need for our housing needs analysis? What do you need for housing? What does that look like? What are the barriers that we're overcoming? And so really leaning into that, the individual knows best or the community knows best. Transparency and accountability. We have a whole lot of information that comes our way. Sometimes we're great at sharing it, putting it on the web, getting it out there. But we are still growing and learning and adapting. We've learned a lot the last few years through COVID. We're here hybrid, which is awesome. We've really learned that that's a great place to be able to get more accessibility. We've been able to reach community in a way that we haven't been before. And so really focusing on what does that look like? If we do open houses, maybe we do 2 instead of 1. And we do 1 on a weekend and 1 in the evening during the week, because we'll be able to tap different people whose work schedules might not just be a Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. One of the things I'm really excited about and that we're starting to coach teams on is maybe we do more of the digital piece of things. We make recordings almost like a teachable model so that it's not even on a timeline. You watch what the presentation and the education piece will be, and then you're able to give your feedback so that it's on your own time, and we're able to get more participation because of that accessibility factor. And that leans into that transparency, because then it's there, it's front and center. We can have QR codes that lead to it, like all the possibilities of leaning into technology and some of the lessons we've learned through COVID. But it also builds that accountability. If it's there and we commit to something, then there's something to trace back to. Meaningful participation, I mentioned it before, not just being the check the box. Oh, I have to go out. So like, oh yeah, I talked to 100 people, so we're good now. We want it to be authentic. We want it to be genuine. We have some relationship building to do and some relationship repair work to do. And so having it be that coming who we are, calling out where we struggle or what our boundaries are and barriers are, is going to be way more intentional than just give us what you need. Okay, thanks, bye. And then not ever seeing it show up again in the work. Accessibility, how are we showing up? Are we showing up in person with food? Where are we showing up? Really encouraging our staff to be in person themselves in community. So if that means at a neighborhood association meeting, awesome. If it means at a farmer's market or at a community event, being there as themselves, being able to answer questions and be accessible to community, we're really leaning into. It's more of a lift on us, but like we're here for it because we know that's how we'll get the better equitable results. And then the strong civic infrastructure. We're going through that now with the reorg and all of that, of really being able to build a functional system that works for all of our community, not just for our communities that have the ability to access it. And so that's an exciting time for us as a city to be able to lean in and say, how do we make this work as a city as a community, as our commissions, all of that, so that it's serving everybody and not just a portion of the community that historically it has served. All right, the Community Involvement Committee. This is a committee that I staff. We meet once a month and advise on community outreach for teams. We'll see teams, I usually say, in 3 different ways. Sometimes it is at the inception of a project or program. They're like, okay, here's what I want to do. How should I be mindful of how we show up to community? And what does that look like? And then they'll build out their outreach plan from feedback that they got from the CIC. Sometimes we will see them right before they do the outreach. Here's what we're thinking. How does it sound? What does it look like? Things to keep in mind. And the committee will comment on that. And then sometimes it's afterwards and being able to do a review, lessons learned. What did it look like? How did it go? And any of those places are fine. Some teams will come once, some will come multiple times in all 3 of those spaces, which is good too. Sometimes we'll call a team to us and say, hey, we want to hear about what you're working on. Can you give us a status update? What is that? So it's really a resource for our project, specifically the planning teams, to be able to come and get advice and recommendations on what outreach and engagement looks like. I apologize. This one is kind of wordy, but there's a lot that our equity and engagement team does. So I wanted to make sure we captured that. So 2 years ago, almost 3 now, the Bureau decided that we needed an equity and engagement team and really wanted to put that emphasis and priority, like put our money where our mouth is, that this is something that's important and needs to be ingrained into the work that we do. And so pulled some of us from other teams that were already doing outreach and engagement and formed what we call, in short, is the EE team. These are the things that we assist with, and they lean into both the equity and engagement. We are a resource for everybody in the Bureau. Usually people will come to us, but if we get pinged to any kind of issue, we'll also go to teams and be like, let's have a chat, let's work at this together. What am I missing, or is there things, and really work collaboratively. We're not a watchdog of like, no, you did this wrong, but really want to be a place where people are comfortable coming in, no matter where they're at in their equity and engagement journey. We have a lot of amazing staff that have this work dialed in and still check with us just to be sure. And then we have some that are just beginning their equity and outreach journey, and we help to develop that and really be mindful of how we show up and what we're doing. So these are a list of 2 things. They really fit pretty squarely into 2 buckets that we can assist with: the logistics, how we execute the equity work, and the strategy, almost like in a consultative type role. So things like our equity toolkit, which we'll go over, the public meetings, especially with the changes in the norms. It used to be, sure, you do a public meeting in the evening, during the week sometime, you have childcare, you have food, like life is good. And then COVID hit and it upended all those rules. And so now we're coaching on like, okay, let's make sure that it's hybrid, because childcare isn't really a possibility, but people can join remotely and be welcoming if there's kids in the background, no big deal. Here's food and food considerations. Maybe we have it recorded so that people can access it later. And so really coach through what all of that looks like, timing, execution, all of that. How we compensate communities to not be extractive of the input that they give. We have a lot of workshops, listening sessions, advisory bodies, and we want to be mindful of who's showing up, and that's a lift, no matter what, like whether it's a commute or a juggle or time, to be mindful of what that looks like. And so we'll work with teams on how to make sure that we're not being extractive of community, especially with our focus being on vulnerable communities. We don't want to continue that, perpetuate that cycle of like give. Identifying appropriate vendors and open contracts, that helps with the execution of the work. So who do we go to if we need help? I'm sure some of you have seen projects come in that they worked with a contractor to be able to build capacity. And so we can help coach on who's best fit for that, especially if there is an outreach component, that there's some great companies and organizations here in the city that can assist, and be mindful of who are we trying to reach, who's our target demographic, and who's best suited to be in that space. Our Bureau Accessibility and Language Access Coordinator is housed on our team. So any of the interpretation, translation type things, we will do that. It's always custom to the project and team of what languages does this need to be translated into? What interpretation do we need to have here? And took it out of, there's a little blurb usually at the end of invitations saying, call this number if you need language services. But what we found is nobody called that number. And then we'd get to the space and we're like, oh, shoot, we didn't book an interpreter for this language because we didn't know. And so thinking like, okay, it's this part of town. We'll work with our GIS team. What are the 4 or 5 major languages that are spoken there and tailor it specifically to that? And that's the languages that we'll do. So every project will be different maybe in what language we're accessing and supporting. Demographic collection has been really big in our bureau, and we're actually influencing it citywide because we have our tech services team at BPS, which is great because our planners get to be on the front line of how do we do that evaluation, what do we need to collect, but also be mindful of what's scary to collect. So what do we need, how are we going to use it, where does it show up, and create some best practices that are now being adapted citywide. I will say that BPS is a pioneer a lot of times in the work that we do with equity, and it oftentimes will get adopted to other bureaus, which I think is a huge testament to the work that our staff does, that it's like, oh my gosh, this is great, we'll set this as the standard for the city. So being in that spot is rewarding and helpful, and gives a really good vote of confidence to those steps that we're taking and being in a lot of those first spaces. Strategy, there's community engagement plans. Every project has a community engagement plan that can go through us so we can get eyes on it, make sure that it sounds good, make tweaks and adjustments. Hey, this is feasible. Hey, this isn't. This sounds awesome. Do we really need to do it this way? Or let's try this new thing over here. Those are the kinds of critical questions that we'll ask when we go through there. Anybody on staff can fill out a request form to be able to reach or set up a meeting or get services from the EE team, and that happens regularly. Last year we had just over 100 requests that run the gamut of all different things. So it's been a good resource for our staff to come. Helping to identify those partners and stakeholders. Who needs to be in the room? Like, who needs to hear this, and what does that look like and when? And helping to support those partnerships and engagement. And then troubleshooting. Stuff happens. We want to be equitable, and then we hit a roadblock and we're like, oh, what do we do? We're at a crossroads. And so our team is equipped to be able to help navigate what those are and make the best case scenarios when we're in those spaces, which is awesome. All of us have also taken formal training on results-based accountability, which in a nutshell is, here's what we're trying to achieve. Like, I'll throw out an example of, like, we want everyone in Portland to live in resilience and comfort and safety and have shelter. And so once you have that goal, then you build how does that happen? So maybe that means we have more low-income housing. So we're looking at it in zoning. We're doing the housing needs analysis right now. Okay, we need to make sure that we have enough housing for everybody. They maybe need income. So what does that look like with our economic opportunity analysis? How do we show up in that? And so it's really taking the big buckets of, here's how we want things to function, and then here are the pieces that we utilize to get there. So all of us have had that training on the EE team and can coach teams on how to do that and really be specific on the targets and the outcomes that we do to get those equitable results. All right, so this is an overview of the toolkit. So a little background and history on what this is. We had an equity toolkit, have had one for lots of years. A previous staff member developed it. It wasn't super user friendly, but the content was awesome. And so we went on a journey that took about a year, and we worked with a contractor to really focus on making it accessible to our staff, usable for our staff, and something that they would want to be able to utilize and apply to the work. And after a year of tweaking it and making adjustments and really putting it through this process, doing a good analysis through different members of each team, because BPS is unique, that we have planning, climate, OCT, like all the things, and we wanted it to be usable for everybody, that we landed here. And this is something that's available to all staff Once we rolled it out last year, every single person in BPS was trained on it in groups of 10. We wanted to make sure it was a small group that was able to really dig into the work. Equity training can be scary and vulnerable, especially if you're beginning in the journey. And so we really wanted to be mindful of that, but make sure that everybody was starting of, hey, this is the standard, this is the expectation, that this is what we're doing. After we trained our current staff, now as we get more, every time we get 10 new hires, we run another training. So anybody who works for planning and sustainability goes through this education piece and how to use it so that they're comfortable using it, they're familiar with it, and are able to apply it to their work. We feel like it is applicable. I know it says like who should use this toolkit. That pretty much covers everybody, like any kind of people managers, program managers, BPS leaders, and then the people who are under those umbrella, that we really lean into. This was designed to be used by anyone and everyone, from our finance team to our program managers to our exec team. Everybody can find functionality in it. The 7 chapters here, I call them chapters, they're sections, but they're really individual buckets I want to run through with all of you. And that equity analysis is the key point. No matter where you're at in a project, if you haven't, because we acknowledge that some of these projects are 5, 10, 15 years long, so they had already started when we came out with that. We wanted you to start at the equity analysis because that really is the foundational block of how we carry the work forward. If we don't have that initial baseline, then we're kind of like skipping ahead and we're going to miss pieces. So in that space, we go through critical thinking of what does it look like? Who would the impacts be? Are there historic disparities that we need to account for? Where do we need to get more information because there's unknowns? And you work through that process. We coach all of our teams not to do this on their own. I would not do the equity toolkit just by myself. I would want to have multiple voices and minds in the room that bring a variety of perspectives to that space. We've had great results when we go across the whole bureau or even bring people from outside of the bureau in because of those different lived experiences. So, hey, we're going to do this thing. Patricia, will you join me even though it's not a planning thing because you have different thoughts and feelings? Hey, Julie, can you join us and do this? And that has been wildly successful in just unearthing some of the inequities that we then need to address further on in the program and in the process. Once you finish that, we move on to the stakeholder mapping and analysis. This is where we examine power dynamics, who has the loudest voice, but also who's the most impacted. And sometimes those line up, but oftentimes they don't. A lot of times I'll use like renters versus homeowners, that a policy may impact renters way more, but that homeowners tend to be the ones that maybe get the mailings because things kind of get messy sometimes when it gets sent to multifamily, or they may have higher income, which means more flexibility sometimes on time or things like that, that we have some of those things to navigate. And if we know that there is a disparity in that power dynamic, it allows us to lean in on how do we right size that. If we know that this is going to impact this community more, but it's going to be way harder for them to engage with us and give feedback, then we can intentionally build out our outreach plan to center their voices. And that might look like, hey, we give the BIPOC community the first go round. We're not going to exclude anybody, but like let's center the historically vulnerable voices and people who haven't been at the table first, and then we maybe go to workshops, and then maybe we do the open houses, and then we have a plan that then would later make it to all of you. So those are the kinds of processes that we really work out in that second section, to be mindful of how we're doing the work and who's being heard and who has access to it. Equity action feasibility analysis. A lot of us have these aspirational goals of if we could do it the way we wanted to, it would have all the things. We'd be able to reach everybody. But the reality is oftentimes that we don't have that capacity for all the reasons, whether it's time or staffing or money, or we just don't know how. You know, we could do the best outreach available, but we're never going to reach everybody. And so really looking at what is our capacity and how do we do it? And we might have to make some hard decisions, but this walks us through what those decisions are so that they are intentional, sometimes not ideal, oftentimes, and especially in government work, we can't do all the things that we want to do, but we can make the best decisions possible. And this helps really ground us in that so that we have that, okay, we made some tough choices, but here's the why. And to be able to have an artifact that shows that. One of the things that we realized the last 3 years, we experienced a great recession just like everybody else. And when people, not recession, resignation, when people left, we sometimes didn't have those whys anymore. And being able to have something like this where we can then answer and have a document that says, oh, okay, this was the thought process. Maybe it turned out great. Maybe there were some lessons learned, but we can at least follow how we got to what we did and be able to go from there. Budgeting, money's always a thing. So being mindful of that, one of the focuses of the EE team is to really center the funding of the work that we do, where oftentimes historically money has been like, what's left over? Okay, we have this much left over. That's what we have to do outreach work with, or this is how much we have left to make sure that it's equitable, and really flipping the script of how much do we need to do the outreach and equity work right. And so this walks you through of here's what you want to do, here's how much it costs. Our team helps consult and coach on that too, of sometimes things are crazy more expensive than we would ever anticipate. We can also help offset some of those costs. Language access can get spendy, but our comms team has a budget for it. Any of those things, even meeting spaces. And so really right sizing that so it's not, okay, here's my plan, and then like, oh, I only have this much, it's not going to work. So hopefully we can get in front of it and start really flipping the order that we do things to be mindful engagement and equity work. After that, data collection and evaluation plan. I've really been leaning in and will continue to lean in on how we learn from what we do, because every project and program that we do is going to be a learning opportunity, but we only know it if we do that evaluation piece. And it's really easy. Our staff has a lot on their plate to be like, okay, we're done. Here's what's next. And missing that feedback loop and being able to learn from what we are. So this centers what data do we need to collect so that we can be collecting it along the way, and what's our plan for it so that we can continue to learn and be there and making steps forward. The ongoing decision making helps us with hard choices. It's almost like a pros cons list a little bit. Like, okay, we're at a crossroads. We got to make some decisions. What happens if we make this one? What happens if we make that one? Again, to help memorialize the choices that we made and the why, and be able to be grounded in that why. Here's why I was solid in it. You know, we don't know how it's going to turn out, but it's definitely with the best of intentions, and here were the reasons behind it. Oftentimes, almost always, when we do outreach, there's going to be conflicting things that there's zero way that you hear everybody's voice, but the way that you can implement everybody's voice. If they're in direct conflict, we're going to have to make a choice. And so this will help capture that for our staff of which way did we go and why, because we heard clearly this and clearly that, and they're direct opposites. So we're not going to be able to please everyone. And then the templates and resources are just additional resources. Some of it is definitions. A lot of the lingo and equity work is fuzzy, maybe, like, what does that mean? You know, everybody has their own definition. What I think might be totally different, even if I'm using the same language, of what any of you think. And so we've made some very clear definitions of when we say this, this is what we mean, so that we can be on the same page. And also laid out a lot of the key entities that we interact with in a bureau and that influence our work. I'm sure you all have seen that a lot of the work that BPS does also has other bureaus or the TriMets or the Metros or the state that are involved too. And very rarely it feels like, or is it ever just a BPS thing? And so it helps lay out some of those relationships for our staff. All right, this is what I touched on earlier, is the spectrum of public participation. IAP2 is an organization that came out with this about 20 years ago, and it's still going strong because it's good. It's worth going strong about. But it really looks at, where do we involve community? How do we involve community? And where does it land on the spectrum? And so the inform is what I touched on earlier of, our hands are tied. We got to just do this thing for whatever reason it is. And so it's an information sharing campaign. Here's how this is impacting you. Here's what you need to know. And there's absolutely a place for that sometimes. Sometimes it's on the other end of empower. Those projects are super fun and super awesome to really just be like, community, tell me what you need, and we'll shape the work around you. Oftentimes it falls in the middle there somewhere of consulting, involving, collaborating. Hey, let's bring in community-based organizations so that we can put our heads together. Here's what we can do. Here's what you can do. Tell us what you need or what you're hearing from community. A lot of times in that collaboration and involved space, we're able to get better information and better results because those other entities have a better relationship with community. Like, just, we're the government. We are. It's not usually warm, fuzzy friendlies when the city comes knocking at your door, but sometimes if we're partnering up with another organization that we have a good relationship, it can help build that gap and build that trust so that we can be in that space and be able to have those fruitful, genuine conversations. So oftentimes it falls in the middle, but what our goal is to ask the questions why. Like, if we're in a consult, could we be in an involve? Like, what's keeping us where we are, and can we start pushing up the spectrum and really teasing apart what that looks like and how it looks? And that's what we encourage our teams to do, and what we also push them to do. Like, could we involve more? Do we have to do it on a compressed timeline? What's kind of setting these barriers in place and be able to move it? And so those kinds of just different accountability practices, resources that are available to our staff, and what we encourage them all to do and hold our staff accountable for is all happening in the space before we get to planning commission. So we thought it would just be good for you all to have that background of what's happening behind the scenes and that foundational piece before everything is fully baked. And here, I found this quote from Lori Lightfoot, the mayor of Chicago, and I felt like that really captured a lot of what we do and how we do it. I learned early on about the real meaning of equity and inclusion, and that when those guiding principles are not met, they can have devastating effects on individuals, families, and communities. And really the work that we're doing is to do the opposite of that, of like, if we do have equity and inclusion, then it can also have really positive impacts on our city, on our families, and our communities. And so really focusing and leaning in on that of how do we get to those positive outcomes. And that's that symbiotic relationship between equity and outreach, and why we really marry the two in what we do, and increasingly lean into that with our teams and our project teams, and hold that line of, you got to do both. They go together, and you're not going to reach one without the other. All right, so I left time for questions. I'm sure you maybe have some, but happy to answer anything or clarity, anything like that for you.
Thank you so much. I'm looking online as well to see if our commissioner's there. So feel free, commissioners joining virtually, raise your hand if you have questions. My question was about I know you touched on it a little bit, the intersection between the engagement and equity work that BPS is doing, but how do you navigate a community situation where, the actual oversight of a topic that comes up might be in the realm of housing, PHB, or might be in the realm of PBOT, and those bureaus aren't represented? Do you have sort of active dialogue between the bureaus to say, hey, this issue came up? Is there brainstorming? Just sort of curious about how that plays out, as we know complicated issues can touch on various bureaus and oversight in the city.
Absolutely. That's a great question. Historically, we've operated what oftentimes gets termed as silos. It's like, here's the BPS silo, and here's maybe the Water Bureau silo. And that was something that pinged for us several years ago, especially even though the EE team wasn't created. Those of us who are now on it started really piecing apart of, we need to find our counterparts in these other bureaus and start making relationships with them, similar to how we make relationships with community, because so much of our work overlaps. Things come up all the time, especially in this bureau. I came from parks, and it happened there too, but not to the extent of here because we really have hardly any of our own proprietary things here. Like it's going to touch another bureau. And so already starting to kind of like knock on that door of we need to make friends. We termed it very jovially with these other bureaus. And that has increased leaps and bounds because it wasn't just us asking those questions, it was the other bureaus too. And so as we started to find each other and make those relationships, that has made it infinitely easier. So it's not necessarily a prescribed, here's what we do or how we do it, but really intentionally saying, like, hey, who are your outreach people in Water Bureau? Who are your outreach people in these other places? Oftentimes our work will overlap, especially when we're doing engagement. And so that has really helped us build those relationships and bonds that if our staff is tabling at one place and developmental services is tabling at another place, then our people get to know each other. But we also took an intentional step of knocking on some of those doors and saying, who is our person at this bureau? Can we meet? Can we chat? What are you doing? Obviously, the city is going through a lot of change, and we know with the restructuring that we work already a lot with BDS and housing and Prosper. But as soon as those things started coming down in January of how we were going to be restructured, we started all intentionally meeting together. So all of our community engagement strategists started meeting together at least once a month, if not more frequently. And same with our equity managers. So we already kind of got out in front of it as soon as we got word that this was a thing that was happening to be able to work more collaboratively. And these people weren't unknown to us because we had started that work before, but now there was more of a focus to why we're meeting of, okay, if we do this, then this. And sometimes what we find in the planning projects is we're making the rules or the code, but BDS is executing. And sometimes with the outreach, the feedback that we get isn't so much about the code, but that implementation. And so being able to share that and having that open communication of, we heard this, so you know, we can start that thing before they even do their outreach. Or if we're doing housing stuff, let's tap the housing bureau too before we even start our outreach, so we're not being duplicative. One thing that we are wrestling with is tapping the same communities over and over and over again. And even though it might be a unique question that I am asking them to me, they've been asked 5 times by all the other bureaus because they all had the same question. And so rewriting what that looks like of the engagement does not necessarily have to be from each individual team every time because we're seeing engagement fatigue. And so building that relationship with those other bureaus to say, do you already have this information? Like in the last year, did you already ask these questions? To be mindful of that space. And extra benefit, it does help us with time too, but that kind of was forced by people are tired of talking to us sometimes, or we're tapping the same people over and over again. So how can we do this differently? And building those relationships with those other spaces has really been instrumental in that. And we continue, like every week, every day, we're in those spaces. And more bureaus are doing things that invite everybody else in. So our Office of Community and Civic Life has done a lot of engagement and starting to set some citywide standards of what it looks like. And so invited a lot of us in to be a part of that process. Additionally, so is our OMF, Office of Management and Finance, is doing the same thing in convening. And that results-based accountability training that I went through were people from every bureau. So we're starting definitely to build those bonds and those relationships because of that, because it's not just us, and we need to reach out to housing or parks. If we want to increase our tree canopy, urban forestry is a big player in that, so we need parks available in that space. Yeah.
Commissioners, Patricia Diefenhofer, for the record, I just wanted to also, that was really a great characterization of, how we all do the work, but and you, of course, already know this, but you see that a lot of the long-range planning projects, they really are interdisciplinary and they involve lots of different departments, bureaus. So the practice in planning and among planners is that you're often reaching out to other bureaus, not just the equity and engagement folks, but also the subject matter experts on whether it's transportation or whether we have, we don't have enough stormwater infrastructure in an area that we're planning, and we coordinate very closely with BES. You all have seen examples of that. And so it's very ingrained in the work because the comprehensive plan touches every subject, right? As you've been exposed to. So, just wanted to also point that out.
Thank you for that response. I thought I saw Vice Chair Pouncil hand up, but I think you
Yeah,
may
yeah,
have taken
I
it
did
down.
raise my hand. I'm sorry, my internet is a little weird, so I'm gonna go off screen while I'm talking, so it doesn't, so you can hear me. My question was well, first of all, thank you so much for being here and sharing that with us. That was great, and I'm super excited to hear that you're working with Civic Life as well. I think that's really awesome. I encourage that for sure. But my question was, I was like wondering how do you actually and maybe I don't think you touched on this, but how do you measure your success? How do you measure or know that what you're doing, that this is actually working? I work with community groups, and you know um, I can't, where I work and what I do, I can't necessarily use like race or ethnicity really to make sure that the demographics is different. I have to use something else like age or income, to see how people are actually, how I'm bringing in people to be aware about what's happening, especially because Portland is such a white city, and so it's kind of hard to get, like you said, you keep running into the same folks you may be asking, getting them wanting to be engaged. So I was just wondering to know, how do you measure your success on engagement?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's twofold because part of it's data, like who are we reaching and how are we reaching them? And so every year, and we're almost due for another equity and engagement team report of the work that we've done and who we were able to reach. But part of it is also the story and leaning into that who did we hear from? And if it's communities that we haven't heard from in the past, what were those headways and where were those bridges that were built figuratively to be able to get into community? But definitely when we're looking at that spectrum of engagement, we can clearly say like, okay, with this project, we were able to push it one step further to be able to engage more. Or we were able to, one of kind of the success stories of late is we kind of had a norm of how many people would attend an open house, whether online or in person. And a team broke the mold and went out to a community event. And they were like, oh my gosh, we were able to touch so many more people. Like just the head count of who they were able to talk to in that way, in that mode, was so much greater than what they had been able to get at open houses. And so we're able to track those numbers too of where we showed up, who we're talking to, what the feedback is, how much feedback are we getting? And that was part of the way that we knew that there was some of that fatigue is like, oh man, we're not getting results. We're doing all the things right if it's like by the book, but nobody responded to the survey or nobody showed up to the online thing. And what does that look like? So being able to measure some of those successes also helps to carve our direction that we want to go, and why we really started leaning into the recordings and the hybrid scenario, because we were able to track the numbers of people that we were reaching. Some of our workshops, not so much planning specific, but with climate and solid waste and recycling, when we were able to stream those live, even if we didn't have a ton of numbers when we recorded it, if we were seeing 13,000 hits within 2 months, we absolutely knew it was worth it because we were able to track, wow, we were able to reach a whole lot more people. Same with like youth engagement, where in the past we could go to a classroom and talk about planning or a project that we're doing, which is great. But when we're able to hit those bigger groups of students because it's an online workshop or webinar, that's a very easy trackable success. If we went from 30 students up to 500. And so being able to be in those spaces are some of the data and demographics that we'll look at of who we're reaching, how we're reaching, and if it was a success.
Thank you. Additional comments or questions from the commission? Yeah, go ahead.
I will always have questions. Okay, good. First, way to go. That was a lot of information. I feel like just the equity toolkit could have taken a long time, and you distilled it. Thank you so much. So many questions. One, thank you for sharing also about because I've heard and been a part of groups where it's feeling the fatigue and oftentimes because we know like we know this person, like we know Joy, we know Duncan, we know these people, so I'm curious um what BPS's role in terms of community inreach, like in partnership with organizations, looking at this is going to get weedy, but like contracts versus RFPs. This has come up a lot in terms of being able to value people's time better, and also to bring and support new emerging organizations into the work to build out more diversity, to build out perhaps a more resilient ecosystem of community feedback.
Absolutely. There's a lot of different threads that we can go there. So bear with me as we go through this. Absolutely, there's a lot of pros and cons to the different routes that we go in compensating community, like whether it's an RFP or we do like a one-off contract, or in the past we were able to utilize gift cards for the accessibility feature, not so much with organizations, but with individual people. And so what that would look like is a team would come to us and say, hey, here's what we have in mind. What's the best route? And so we would look through like, okay, what's our timeline? What's the amounts? What are we trying to accomplish? Who is it? And then say, okay, this makes the most sense. And it can be intricate. And so we'll always bring our finance team in because we have a lot of rules on how we pay people and what that looks like. And so we want to make sure that we're playing by those rules. And that's a relationship that in the past has been hard because we're like, we want to do this like as community engagement people. And we were not necessarily on the same page as some of our internal facing bureaus because their job is like protecting the city. And those didn't always jive. I would say in the last year, we've taken huge strides to come together. I meet fairly regularly with like our deputy controller of here's what we're trying to do and why, and actually opening up those conversations and then being able to have like, okay, well, here's from maybe a tax burden, what we're working with or a legal thing. And so us able to actually collaborate together to say, okay, here's the rule, like legally we can't do these things, but here's what we're trying to accomplish. How do we get to that space? It's a process for sure, but I'm encouraged and excited that those conversations have been happening recently and that there's that drive to do that. I think further conversations that are coming out of our Office of Management and Finance is like bringing in those extra contracts. And so even at BPS, our EE team staff has consulted on what does it look like to bring in more vendors from vulnerable communities, because there's some hard barriers of even just like getting into a place where you can apply for an RFP and what that looks like. When COVID hit, we had just gotten things ironed out to be able to almost do like an info night with childcare providers for outreach of like, hey, who's our childcare providers that are owned or run by communities of color? Let's have them all come in together, tell them to bring this stuff, and we'll walk them through that process because it's very legalese and scary and in that space to help do it. But it's great to have that buy-in, that overarching buy-in, because in the past it was us really just trying to do it ourselves. Like I would go to a childcare provider with my laptop and walk them through by speed so that we could get them in a place where they were then eligible to get city contracts. And so being able to break down some of those barriers on a more meaningful level, so it's not always just one-on-one staff time, is great, but we're not there yet. We are much better than we were even a year ago, but acknowledging some of those, whether it's language barriers or just it is scary. Like you're answering questions, you're like, I don't even actually maybe know what this means. So I'm making a best guess, but being able to really alleviate some of those and highlight that. We're also looking with some of our work of how do we open those pathways? Do we, when we do an RFP, maybe do it for a longer period of time and break it into 2 chunks? So that way the first one is probably going to go to the company or the organization that already is established and has it dialed in and can really easily plug into the work. And maybe the second half goes to the one that needed that contract to be able to ramp up, but then they have a year to get ready and hire staff and things like that. So those are some of the trying to think outside of the box to be able to open up those doors for other organizations. On a smaller scale, we look at where we're spending our money, like money speaks. And so being able to look locally, encouraging our staff, like who are we choosing to spend our money with and from, and those kinds of things. So really making some judgment calls but being mindful of where that's coming from and who we're utilizing and what that looks like. So it hopefully is going more large scale for sure, and it will. It's just a process, especially with all the tumultuous right now in the city. Yeah. Did I answer all of your question?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
I have more.
Yeah, I love questions.
Great,
Yes.
great. Because I have them for days. I only have a few more. Just a kind of a quick one on the wealth indicator of the equity atlas. It referred to income. Do we also track wealth in terms of assets? I'm thinking of, for example, like the concerning decline of Black home ownership, for example, over the past, 10, 15 years?
Yeah, there's some. A lot of that will come from like census data. It gets part of that demographic collection that I said that BPS is working on and really going out citywide is being mindful. And money is a tricky thing because when people respond to us, it becomes a part of public record. And so threading that needle of the questions we're asking and how we're asking them. And we're getting to a point where we're figuring out some pieces, but it is harder to get accurate data because even if you ask it, sometimes they'll leave that one blank because they're like, you don't need to know. But also like making sure that their information is protected, because if it correlates like with name and address, then somebody could do a public records request and get all of that information. And so our tech services and data teams are really looking at that of how can we get that information in a reliable way, but also protect and be a safe space, because right now we're not coming across as that way. So definitely lots of headway being made, but it is a harder number to track. It is taken into account in some of the recent reports that teams are working on, look at not just the home ownership and those assets, but also the state of those assets, like how many homes are in a place of some level of disrepair or need some major renovations done, or what those kinds of dynamics that are in place. So we try as best as we can. Sometimes the data just does not exist that we would like to have, or not in a reliable way as much as we would like it to be.
Okay.
Yeah.
My last question. At the beginning, we were talking about performance evaluations for staff.
Yes.
They include anti-racism, equity, collaboration. I'm curious. I mean, we're a body. We have just started. We've talked about efficiency and effectiveness. How do we get measured every year? Can we? Like, I mean, if we're talking about creating bylaws where we're looking to move forward. One thing that I kept coming back to as we were dissolving the Planning and Sustainability Commission, when we were talking about mission and purpose, was like, has there ever been that zoning has been a tool of racism and exclusion and identifying winners or losers in an economic standpoint in particular across the nation, and definitely including Portland? Has there ever been a planning commission? How do we know that we are actually furthering that we are furthering anti-racism. Um, North, how would you evaluate us, Harmony, and how do we build that into our operations?
Yeah, a couple things immediately come to mind is part of why we run trainings like this, not just with you, but with all of our staff. We shared a lot of this content at the Northwest Public Employee Diversity Conference last year that like we're putting it out there because that helps build accountability. And I would hope that in the process of doing that, that it also builds a safe space for if you all started leaning towards a way that whoever's presenting or anybody, or if I happen to be at a meeting, could be like, sounds good, but can you explain this to, like, how does equity fit into this? Or these are red flags that are being pinged. Hopefully, by the time something gets to y'all, we've done that work so that it's not a big lift on the commission to be that gatekeeper, that we've vetted it, you know, but having those increased checks and balances and having it be an acceptable spot for all of us to be called out on, like, there's some problems here, or like this is pinging for me, and being able to work that out in a mature and safe space or safe manner, because there's also different perspectives. Like somebody doesn't have to be right and somebody wrong, and so being able to say, well, here's where I was coming from on this, or what I was thinking. Or sometimes with those hard choices, we know that no matter what, there might be an inequitable action, and so being able to own that. We know that this is going to happen, but also here's our plan down the road. Like that is my hope for teams, that if we know that we're not just stopping there and being like, yeah, stinks. There's a bad thing, but like this stinks, which means we have to do something else too, in conjunction with that. So I think that's step number one, is the more people that hear these commitments, that know what we're doing, know what the standards are for our staff in our bureau, the easier it is to hold accountability for all of us. So not just for the Planning Commission, but the accountability for our staff and the projects that are going forward. The accountability for me, if somebody, Patricia, can say in a meeting, be like, what are we doing, Harmony? Like, you're the equity manager and this ping's wrong, or we've gone down the wrong path here. We need to fix it. This isn't working. So I think that's number one. As far as like a formal evaluation, Patricia, thoughts? I've never had to evaluate like a volunteer body before. I mean, maybe we can do that.
Patricia Diefendorfer for the record. I mean, I think it's, I think that hasn't been done to my knowledge. I think it's interesting. I think that you get, I think you now see that staff does a lot of work up front to investigate these issues and try to understand what the ramifications are of different recommendations. And so hopefully, if anything you take away from this training, is that hopefully you feel some level of confidence that it's so embedded and ingrained in the way that we do our work that you don't have to be overly concerned that we aren't doing it or that we haven't investigated it. I think that, that should be something that we should continue to talk about as we evolve, as this commission evolves as a body, as you see the range of projects. I don't have an answer now, but I do think that, we're all held. I mean, the commission is a creature of the city, right? It's a city body, and the city's own core values is equity and anti-racism. So all of us, I mean, I think what, Harmony's saying is very true. I know I take it seriously, and I know all the staff takes it seriously, that we are all held to that value and that standard. And so to the best of our abilities, we're trying to do that in the work. Obviously, we still operate, and I think, Harmony, you were alluding to this as well, that we still operate in a system that has a lot of laws and rules about what you can and can't do. And so we still have to kind of operate within those frameworks. So I would say this is a conversation that, maybe in a future, like as we all get our bearing together, future retreats or future conversations, we can investigate further.
One other thing that came up while Patricia was speaking for me is that as all of our equity managers in the city, most bureaus have their own. Some are represented by like one person, like a few of the smaller bureaus roll up into one equity manager, that we have a racial equity work plan, and we are in the process of developing a new one, like just like our strategic plans or comp plans, that they need to be redone. And so that's a place where we have some of those bigger, higher overarching goals, and then we list out like how it shows up. So one thing maybe that Patricia and I could talk about is like when we're saying, hey, here's our racial equity work plan, how does that show up with the Planning Commission? So it could be kind of lumped into that. So not a report that you all had to do, but hey, this is a reflection of the equity work that we do, because it captures everything that the bureau is doing, and every single bureau does that. But that might be a place where it shows up and kind of solidifies some of that accountability. But my hope would be that we're doing our jobs so that there's not a big lift for you all to be like, this is on us to make sure that we're not doing anything amiss, but that there's that confidence, and that more than anything, like you're that accountability for us of like, how does this fit in, knowing that it's a city core value, and knowing that it's part of our strategic plan and our comp plan, and that we will have to report on it for our racial equity work plan, that it goes both ways. And I appreciate that you're like, how do we hold that line too? But I hope that by the time it gets to you, that's reflected in the presentations that you have. And yeah, and there's not that kind of like pressure to say, oh, how do we make sure it's there?
I guess I was.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. I in
Yeah.
front of you. I guess I was operating from like continued growth.
Yeah,
How do we?
absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, great question. And one thing that came to mind for me, Commissioner Routh, is a request around what resources do you all have that you could potentially share with us as the Planning Commission, right? Books, trainings, I'm sure, or I assume you have a reading list around anti-racism and equity work and planning that, could be shared out to us as commissioners. We as commissioners may have resources that we could share amongst ourselves. And I agree, I think we should keep this in mind. And I, for one, would welcome future trainings or other focused sessions on equity and anti-racism work within planning, and how that touches on our volunteerism as planning commissioner members.
Absolutely. And that's something Patricia and I can work on together. We do have an anti-racist reading group that the staff are involved in. It's voluntary, but a good amount of our staff do participate. So yes, coming up with a book or a reading list is a fairly easy lift. But also that there's ongoing trainings. I guess that's one piece that I didn't touch on, is that part of the purview of the equity and engagement team is a responsibility for trainings to our staff. Every year we do one that's just flat out required. Everybody has to go, and that's the deal. But we also do several more throughout the year that are optional or strongly encouraged sometimes to do. So we just had our required one, which was an LGBTQ training that everybody on staff had to go to. And it tied in because our historic code team is in the process of doing LGBTQ specific historic landmark designation. And so we felt like it would be a great way to support our team that's doing it, but also baseline training on something that's needed. We also have just other trainings that come up. We're doing an inclusive design training for a lot of our planners. And so there may be some spaces where either it's recorded that we could share with you all, or if it's an okay space to invite, and Patricia and I can work on what ones those are that are really just for staff, or which ones we could invite some of our committee and commission members to come to, because I do appreciate growth. And if we have those opportunities, I think increasingly, not just with us, but even cross-bureau, we're opening up those spaces. Again, one of the benefits of hybrid is you don't necessarily have to worry about capacity. So those inclusive design courses that we're running once a month through summer, we're working collaboratively with the other bureaus, and anyone who it's applicable to their work is welcome to come. So we shared that space. Even though we started it was like sharing is caring. Everybody can come if it makes sense to be able to exercise those resources. Some of them are recorded, some of them aren't. That's a delicate line in equity work, because especially if there's feedback, that's something we even talked about today. Part of our equity training when we do it with our staff is we actually do a like case study and work through the first section of the toolkit. So when we run that with staff, but knowing that we want people to be able to speak freely and this being recorded, it was like, do we do that portion of it, or do we want to be able to really be able to get into the nitty gritty, because it's a learning space for all of us. So that's why it's not always available for everybody or in all spaces, but we can definitely be mindful of that and be able to send it out, things that are available or things that are coming up. One of the things that I do with the CIC is also like upcoming opportunities in community too. So that might be something that we can share as well, of like, hey, this is coming up, not put on by the city or by BPS, but it's on our radar. One of the side effects of being in engagement is that oftentimes you know a lot of what's happening out in the city, so we can encourage our staff or fellow partners to attend, or like, hey, there's a free thing, or there's a speaker that's coming and happens to be in town, if you want to check it out, that there's these cool opportunities that we can pass along to. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the great questions, comments, and of course the presentation. Really appreciate you coming and presenting to the Planning Commission today with this important work. I'm not seeing any additional hands or indication of questions, so I think that is our last item, and we are ready to adjourn today's meeting. Thank you all so much.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.